Maybe you've written a Valentine's Day poem. Perhaps you've taken your partner to see her favourite film, knowing you're going to hate it. Or maybe you bought some flowers that weren't from the petrol station. Whilst you might think you've gone above and beyond in the name of love, I'm afraid these trivial gestures are nothing compared to the acts of a man so deeply in love, even death couldn't stand in his way. This is the genuinely terrifying story of Carl Tanzler and the Corpse Bride. Now, I'd like to take a minute to talk about hair loss, because I've had people close to me start to lose their hair as early as their 20s, and it's always been an upsetting experience. If you're in the same boat, then you're not alone. Did you know 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35? But the best thing you can do to prevent hair loss is take the initiative now and do something about it whilst you've still got hair left. Personally, I like Keeps because it makes treatment super easy by delivering your hair loss medication every 3 months straight to your door, so you can say goodbye to awkward doctor visits and waiting in pharmacy checkout lines. There's a really good reason that Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of its competitors, and hundreds of thousands of men trust them for their hair loss prevention medication. So, if you're like me, you're probably not ready to lose your hair just yet, but prevention is key. The faster you act, the faster you'll see results, and the sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. If you're noticing that you're losing your hair, do something about it. For a limited time, go to keeps.com/42, or click the link in the description below to receive 50% off your first order. Thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to try it out using the link below. Carl was born in Dresden, Germany in 1877, and from what we know about him, he lived an entirely uneventful childhood. That is, until he turned 12, when, one night, he was visited by one of his ancestors in a dream. This long-dead relative was kind enough to show Carl the face of his one true love, a beautiful foreigner with dark hair. By the time Carl woke up in the morning, he knew that was the woman he would spend the rest of his life with. The only trouble was, he didn't know where to find her. In the end, it would be more than 40 years before he finally stumbled across this literal girl of his dreams. During the intervening years, Carl became a man, travelled the world, and even got married to a woman named Doris Schaefer. The couple had 2 children together, but fond as Carl was of his wife, he could never quite shake his disappointment that she wasn't that dark-haired beauty once promised to him in a dream. In 1926, he and his family emigrated to the United States to start a new life in Florida. And it was there that Carl's general dissatisfaction with how his life had turned out came to a head. He needed a new start, so he pretty much abandoned his family and took a new job as a radiology technician at a hospital in Key West, rebranding himself Count Carl von Kozel. It was in the April of 1930 that the weird stuff started to happen. One day, a woman was brought into the hospital for an examination. That's not the weird bit. I mean, it was a hospital, but as soon as Carl got a glimpse of the girl, he knew her at once. A beautiful foreigner with dark hair. She was the girl from his childhood dream. As far as Carl was concerned, his soulmate had just conveniently stepped into his place of work. And boy, would she regret it. Maria Elena Milagro de Hoya, who, for obvious reasons, just went by Elena, was a 21-year-old Cuban. If this was a classic rom-com, she would be Rachel McAdams to Tanzler's Hugh Grant. She was technically married, but her husband had left her as she had suffered a miscarriage. And if I'm being completely honest, I don't think her relationship status was all of that much interest to Carl Tanzler. He couldn't care less if she was separated, in a loving marriage, a widow, or one of those strange Americans you hear about who marries their car. He wanted her, and he was going to have her, even if he did happen to be 32 years her senior. There was, admittedly, one other small problem with this plan. Eleanor hadn't been admitted to hospital for a run-of-the-mill checkup. She had tuberculosis, which, considering the lack of an available cure in those days, was basically a death sentence. Even today, TB remains one of the world's leading causes of death, claiming 1.5 million lives in 2020. Carl was understandably devastated, But despite not really knowing all that much about TB, or, actually being a doctor, he made it his life's mission to save Eleanor. He immediately began experimenting with various tonics and concoctions, in the hopes that he'd stumble across a cure. With the permission of Eleanor's family, Carl began administering these treatments in their home, which was soon full of various gadgets that he'd managed to steal from the hospital. Now, so far, Carl Tanzler might not sound like all that much of a bad guy. I mean, he was doing everything in his power to try and save Eleanor, even if some of his methods were a little unconventional. If he'd stopped there, history probably would have remembered him as a misguided and medically irresponsible dreamer, rather than an utter psychopath. But yeah, he didn't stop there. Not even close. Despite Carl's best efforts, Eleanor died in October 1931. He was so devastated he offered to pay for the funeral and for an expensive mausoleum in Key West Cemetery. Her family saw it as a kind gesture, but in reality it should have been a massive red flag, because little did they know, Carl would keep hold of the mausoleum's only key. And this is where our Richard Curtis rom-com meets Tim Burton. For more than a year, Tanzler visited Eleanor's grave every single night. He would sit by her coffin, chatting away as though Eleanor still lived. If anything, his death only seemed to have increased his devotion. But then, all of a sudden, the visit stopped. In hindsight, that should have been another red flag, but I guess Eleanor's family simply assumed Carl Tanzler had finally moved on. Of course, there was only one other reason he would have stopped visiting Eleanor's grave: if she wasn't in it anymore. According to Carl himself, Eleanor's spirit had appeared to him and asked to be taken back to his house. Not one to take the words of the dead lightly, as we've already seen. One night in April 1933, Carl removed Eleanor's body from its resting place and brought it home with him. He'd been told he'd marry this woman, and he wasn't going to let a silly little thing like death stand in his way. There were, of course, a few logistical issues with Carl's new relationship status. Eleanor had been dead for 18 months, and she was aging like a Mr. Whippy in the Sahara. In an effort to stem the decay, Carl built a makeshift lab in his house, and then he got to work. He stabilised the body's shape with coat hangers and wires, and stuffed the torso with rags to fill things out a little. He applied mortician's wax to the face and fashioned a wig out of what remained of her hair. He even replaced her eyes with glass orbs. Tanzler disinfected the body regularly, and that, along with liberal use of strong perfumes, went some way towards masking his new bride's unfortunate odour. By the time he was finished, Tanzler's dream had finally come true, and for the first time in his life, he was truly happy. With all the enthusiasm of a newlywed, he spent almost every moment of every day with Eleanor's corpse. He sat it at the dinner table whilst he ate, danced with it in the living room, and even laid the body beside him in bed as he slept. Hopefully. Of course, all this action soon began to produce inevitable signs of wear and tear on Tanzler's new wife. To make matters even worse, what remained of Eleanor's body was slowly rotting away to nothing. Apparently, dating an actual skeleton was too much, even for Carl Tanzler, so he replaced Eleanor's skin with silk cloth coated in wax and plaster of Paris, essentially building himself a human doll made from bits of real human. Somehow, this absolutely batshit insane situation continued for about 7 years without anybody noticing, meaning Eleanor had been dead for almost 9 years. This is the part in our classic rom-com where you walk out of the cinema because it's disgusting. But it turns out Carl didn't want things to go on this way forever. You see, over the years he'd been working on a strategy to bring his wife back to life for good. The plan basically involved building a rocket and launching Eleanor's dead body into space, where he hoped radiation would restore her to the land of the living, which admittedly was a tad ambitious, but hey. In the end, Carl never got to find out whether this ingenious plan would have worked, though I'm prepared to go out on a limb here and say it probably wouldn't have. Rumours were beginning to spread around Key West about that weird old man who lived alone and hardly left his house except to buy women's clothes and suspiciously large quantities of perfume. One day, a local boy passing the house happened to see Carl dancing with what looked like a large doll in the living room. I suppose we can't really blame him for not immediately suspecting Carl was living with a 9-year-old corpse, but anyway. Others were growing suspicious too. Particularly Eleanor's sister, Florinda, who, perhaps unsurprisingly, had never been Carl's biggest fan. With his story now the talk of the town, Florinda paid Carl a visit in 1940, and it's safe to say she was shocked by what she found. The 9-year-old remains of her sister in a dress. The authorities were immediately alerted, and Carl was arrested. An autopsy soon uncovered the full disturbing details of the horrific makeover, including certain modifications Carl had made to facilitate the consummation of his marriage to Eleanor. Yeah, this is the part in our classic rom-com where it gets banned from Netflix for being too graphic. Despite taking a dead body to his house, living with it, loving it, and planning to shoot it into space, a psychiatric evaluation actually deemed Carl Tanzler to be mentally competent enough to stand trial. He faced the charges of maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. But in perhaps the biggest shock of this whole story, the case against Carl was dropped, and he served not a single day of prison time. Not because he wasn't very obviously guilty, but because the statute of limitations had expired for his offence. As a result, Carl Tanzler was free to go. And he even received quite a lot of positive press coverage and public support, as many people at the time saw his actions as just plain old romantic. People were weird in the old days. In one final twist to this strange, gruesome story, poor old Eleanor's body wasn't reinterred after finally being rescued from Carl's clutches, but put on display at a funeral home. The story was big news, and thousands of people lined up to get a look at her, including Carl Tanzler himself. Rumour has it he'd even asked the authorities if he could have the body returned to him. As you can probably imagine, the request was denied. After interest in the case died down, Eleanor was finally laid to rest once more. This time at a secret location, just in case Carl got any ideas. In later life, Tanzler received US citizenship and wrote an autobiography. Oh, and do you remember Doris? That wife he had before any of this weirdness happened. You know, the mother of his children that he walked out on. Well, they remained friends. You'd think it would be awkward, what with him fancying a dead body more than her, and all that, but apparently not. And she even supported him financially in his later years. I'm sure Carl was grateful, but he never gave up on his one true love. When he died in 1952, his body was found with a life-size doll that bore a striking resemblance to his corpse bride. It's been suggested by some that Carl somehow found out where the real Eleanor was buried and switched the body with a fake. But there's no real evidence to support that story, and as the credits roll on our awful rom-com, I have to say it's much more likely that it was indeed just a doll. Either way, Carl Tanzler's life is surely the weirdest love story never told, and a useful reminder of how not to take a girl out. Thanks for watching.